Well, I honestly think if I only had one day left to go fishing in my life, this is what I would be doing. A big, vast venue, fishing my favourite method, the slider. We're at Underbank Reservoir today, just outside Sheffield, right on the edge of the Peak District in fact. And I'm going to be showing you how to fish a method that a lot of people think's a little bit complicated. You get a lot of tangles and can be quite tricky, but trust me, if you get a few things right, the slider is one of the most enjoyable and effective ways to fish venues like this. So what actually is a slider? Now, a slider is basically a big waggler, a large float that allows you to fish on the bottom in very deep water. Now, where I'm fishing today is about 15 or 16 feet deep, but I've only got a 13-foot float rod. But the beauty of the slider is you can fish with quite a lot of weight down the line to get your bait down in that deep water and keep your rig stable, and your float, as the name is made, will slide up the line until it hits a stop knot. So the rig will sink to the bottom, the float will slide up the line to a stop knot where it'll stop, cock at the right depth, and you're fishing a float effectively on the bottom out in deep water. The key to a successful day's slider fishing is keeping the rig very, very simple. The more complicated you make it, the more chance you'll have of tangles, and it can be very frustrating. So as you can see here, mine is ridiculously simple. I've got a 4-pound Mainline on the reel that's 4-pound drag line. I love that line just because it sinks very quickly every single time. Nice and thin for casting as well. I've then got an 8-pound shock leader, and the reason for the shock leader is just so that when I'm repeatedly casting a very heavy float, especially in windy conditions like today, I can be nice and confident that I'm not going to crack it off. And it also means the bottom end of the rig here that's on 8-pound line is nice and stiff and tangle free. So 4-pound Mainline with an 8-pound shock leader. And then onto the actual rig itself, I've slid on a little plastic bead above my slider and then the slider float, and the bead just stops the float against that stop knot that I've tied at the correct depth. And then terminal wise, I've got a 10-gram Olivet there locked off with a number 8 shot above it and 3 number 8s below. Incredibly simple. I always like to put 3 or 4 shot below just so it creates a little bit of a boom and gives me a little bit of versatility to take one off or put one on if I want to change the shotting. And then 2 feet below that, I've got 2 number 8 shot, and then 2 feet below that, I've got a little tiny swivel and a 12-inch hook length. And then, as mentioned, the actual slider knots, which are 2 stop knots really close together. I always put 2 on in case one comes off, and it just makes it nice and tight and secure, are set at the actual depth. And trust me, if you can keep your rig nice and simple like that, a thick, durable shock leader or terminal end line, stop you getting in tangles, then you'll be in for an absolutely cracking tangle-free day. One of the most difficult things with slider fishing is actually plumbing the depth accurately, and it's quite important because if you were fishing for skimmers and roach on a pole, you'd only want a little bit of line on the bottom and you'd need to be nice and accurate. But a nice little simple way of doing it for you is to fish with or plumb with a little tiny 10-gram plummet on your actual hook. But then if I was to try and plumb up with that setup with my float cocked perfectly, there's a lot of leeway for error because I've got a 10-gram Olivet on the line, I've got a very big float, so I want to add some buoyancy to the actual float so that when I cast it out, the plummet's on the bottom and my line to my float's nice and tight. And how I do that is I simply unscrew the float that I'm fishing with, which is a 12-gram slider, and I replace it with a very, very buoyant 16-gram slider. So this bigger float, when I cast it in with the plummet on, will fire up to the stop knot, nice, stiff, straight and buoyantly, keep everything nice and tight, and I'll get a very accurate reading for plumbing up. And then once I've got the depth, I've got the stop knots in the right place, I'll mark it on my rod so I know what dead depth is. I like to plumb up so I can just see the top of this float sticking out, and then I can put a little bit more line on the bottom, come off the bottom if I want, and of course you've got to screw your actual fishing float back on, which today is a 12-grammer. So plumbing up in short, little 10-gram plummet on your hook, take your fishing slider off, replace it with a bigger, more buoyant one, so it shoots up and keeps everything tight and you're rocking and rolling. So all the technical bits and bobs sorted out, and today I actually started the session by feeding quite a lot of ground bait. When you're fishing big massive places like this, you need to let the fish know that you're there. So I fired out 12 balls as big as I could make with one hand, about 30 metres out, and I'm fishing there because this reservoir slopes away and starts to flatten out about 25 metres, so I'm into the full depth, right out into the lake where hopefully there's going to be some skimmers living. And in them 12 balls that I fired in there, I've got a few casters, a few dead maggots and a few finely chopped worms. Now, one little tip for you when you're firing in your initial bait is to vary how hard you squeeze it, and that's the beauty of the mix that I've used today. It's very, very versatile. So half of the balls I squeeze very, very firmly, so they'll go straight to the bottom and break down slow, so they'll keep fish working for the bait in the swim. And the other half of the balls I just squeeze lightly and only a couple of times, so when I fire them out they hit the surface, break up immediately, give off a big cloud and lots of attraction. That ground bait's falling through the water, loads of sweet smell in it to bring them fish in. So a great little trick for you when you're feeding at the start. Make sure you feed some of them hard to keep the fish in the swim, get them on the bottom, and some of them a little bit softer to actually bring them in the first place. So when you're actually starting to fish a slider, one of the first things to get right, especially when you've got a tricky wind like we have today, is actually casting. Now I've picked a sensible distance today, about 26, 27 metres out, and I'm going to cast past that where I've got a line clip set about 32 metres away from me, and then I'm going to put my rod tip under the water, wind my line back under the water to sink it all. That's the beauty about that 4-pound drag, and then I'll let my line off by opening my bail arm. My slider will slide up and I'll be fishing, and that's where I've fed my initial feed. And I've picked that distance not only because it's full depth of the lake, but I can fish and feed there nice and accurately in this wind. When you're actually going to cast a slider, one thing that you need to do is be very, very smooth. You don't want to go punching it or making any quick movements because you'll get a lot of tangles. A nice smooth arc in the cast and not too much of a punch is the best way to describe it. And I like to keep everything nice and straight by almost swinging it out in front of me, a nice smooth back and a lovely smooth arc forward. And as you saw there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 turns back. As you saw there, it flies so straight without any twisting or bending in the air, and that way, by being smooth and getting that arc in your cast, you never have any problems with tangles. And when I've got back to my 6 turns back point, I've just opened the bail arm and let some line out, and you can always tell if your slider's tangled or not, because if it doesn't pull line off your reel as the float's coming up and the lead's sinking down, then you know that it's tangled up and it's not sliding properly. But that were sliding absolutely beautiful, and now I'm set, I'm fishing right on top of the bait. It's actually towing today, this reservoir, quite aggressively to the left hand side. So this big wind's obviously hitting the dam wall down there and pushing the undertow back to the left. So that's something that's always worth checking before you start. Is it towing? And if it is, which direction? And the reason for that is, today I've fed my bait a little bit down tow, so to the left hand side of me, just because I want to give myself time to get my rig in position, wind back, get my float set, and then run it on top of the bait. Now if I fed all my bait, say slightly to my right or bang in front of me, I'd have to cast miles to the right to get my float set properly. But this way, I fed it slightly to the left, I can cast in front of me, sink the line, and I'm fishing nice and effectively. Feels a little bit like a skimmer, this one. I actually put a couple of red worms on that time. Lovely little fish. Now Underbank, I hope my towels wrap round. Underbank's full of these. and they've got real dark characteristics. I think it's just because they live in such deep water in the winter, but beautiful little fish. Absolutely nailed in the top lip. 16 pole special. Are you allowed to use a pole special on the slider? I think you are, aren't you? It's a cracking hook for this sort of fishing, a pole special, because it's got a long point on it, and that long straight point, I'm sure, when you've got a bit of line laid on the bottom and you're fishing on the deck with a big heavy float, when a fish actually picks the hook bait up, that straight point's very difficult for them to get rid of. Little bit like when you're fishing a feeder. You might have saw on underwater at Ferry Meadows, a pole special was a brilliant hook for them bream on a feeder. And since actually doing that filming, I've used them a lot for my slider fishing as well. Definitely seem to hit more bites and hardly ever lose a fish on them as well. Now the other thing to think about when you're actually fishing and getting into the rhythm, catching a few fishes, it's very easy to be in and out and missing bites on a slider. So a little bit of patience with your bites is really important, and often it's sort of a slow drag under where fish has picked up your hook bait. Obviously it's 15-16 foot deep today, so it takes a little bit of time to register on the float, and it's a slow drag under. But especially with baits like red worms like I've got on at the minute, or a couple of maggots, fish rarely let go of them kind of baits. So I like to let the float go under and almost say in my head, well, that's gone, that's on, and then it's a nice smooth strike upwards. And one little bit of advice when you're fishing a slider in deep water is I always try and strike nice and firmly straight up in the air. Here we go, like so, but then wind a few winds on the handle at the same time. And as you can see there, you get the fish, or you get the line moving, should I say, and just staying tight to it by actually striking and then winding at the same time is very, very effective. Little perch that time, but fish like that, you often miss bites off when you're fishing a slider. So little bit of patience when the float goes under, very important, and then a nice firm big strike up in the air. And when you sort of get to the top of your strike and you're in this position, start winding as well to get nice and tight onto the fish. And a combination of striking in the right way and getting nice and tight onto the fish will mean that you do miss very, very few bites, especially when you have that little bit of patience when the float goes under as well. Now I'm not going to feed too quickly at the start of the session. I've put in them 12 balls to kick off, and I'll probably just see what response I get. I'm catching, you know, a fish most drops in at the moment, so I'm quite happy, but as soon as I start to catch some smaller fish, little perch like the one that I just had is probably a bit of a sign, maybe need to top it up. But a lull in bites or a decrease in the size of fish, or fish like perch coming in, are a good sign that the bait's running out and I'll need to top up. And I've got my bowl full of ground bait next to me. I've already got some casters, dead maggots and chopped worms in it ready, and I'll just start firing an odd ball out there, vary the consistency, a few softer ones to bring them in. There you go, look. But the minute the fishing's absolutely brilliant. They've obviously homed straight in on that ground bait. Think on these big waters like this, having the right mix that has the right flavour and smell in it's so important. You've got to pull them into your peg, and I'm convinced, or I'm really confident personally, that a very sweet smelling ground bait with lots and lots of soluble sweeteners in it is good for drawing these fish straight in. And that super sweet an answer. I know I use it all winter when I fish for these kind of fish, and on any big venue, natural venue, even commercial silverfish fishing, I'm convinced that it gets them kind of fish in your peg very, very quickly. One thing is for sure, it certainly doesn't help, and I am ultra confident in using it. Quite a few people in the winter, we fish a winter league at a place called Hallcroft, and quite a few people come and sniff in and around our van when we're getting set up in the morning, and they're often like, "What's that smell?" Well, now folks, you know exactly what it is. Smells like Mr. Kipling's cake shop. Just going to chop a few worms up, just to put a few fresh ones in if I decide to top it up. I put some in the mix at the start, but especially with chopped worms, I just like a few fresh ones in the ground bait if I'm going to feed them. So I'm just going to have these few ready in the corner of my tub, and I'm just going to add them as I make a ball if I need to top up. Got a feeling we're catching well at the minute, but we will have to start firing a few balls of ground bait in to keep these fish there. There we go. They're right on. I think something chased after that then. There's quite a few pike in this reservoir. This is either a little bit bigger or something definitely had a little go at that then. Might just be a little bit of a bigger skimmer, which is a good sign. Oh, it's a perch. Nice chunky perch. Tricked me, you did, mister, then. Beautiful colours on them out of a big reservoir, aren't they? Absolutely stunning. In terms of hook baits, it is really a case of just varying it up. I absolutely love red worms for them little skimmers. I think that they're the best bait by far for catching them, especially if you're feeding a few chopped worms. And I'm just putting on here sort of 3.5 inch long pieces, so it's quite a big hook bait, but when you look at the size of this place, the fish have got to be a little bit greedy and aggressive to survive. So I don't think a skimmer in here is going to be too put off by a few nice chunks of red worm. Look at that. They just sit perfectly on that 16 pole special. But if there were quite a few more roach to catch, or perch, or even things like hybrids, then maybe a maggot, double maggot could be good, couple of dead maggots. It really is just a case of varying it up, see what's best on the day. But at the minute, 3 nice pieces of red worm seems great for picking out them little skimmers. Just going to flick a few bits of worms in here because I've had a couple of perch now and got a feeling a top up might be needed. A little bit like the initial. Probably going to fire a couple of balls in. On big venues like this, when you're getting runs of fish, I often like to sit and fish for 10-15 minutes, and then I'll fire 3 or 4 balls in, sit and fish for another spell, 3 or 4 balls. And if I can fish that way, I feel like you get into much more of a rhythm. Whereas when you're firing a ball every single cast, it can get a little bit messy. Bit too much bait in your peg. It's very easy to overfeed when you're just firing one every single cast. Quite a nice feeding technique is 2 or 3 balls or 3 or 4 balls, then sit and fish for a short while. 3 or 4 balls, sit and fish for a short while. Judging how good it's been since the start, I think we'll be able to feed in that way today, because they really did come straight to it and settle nicely on that bait. I mean, this is the first run through that we've had with it drifting. I mean, now it's right to the left-hand end of the bait and it's not gone yet. So I'm thinking perhaps we need to give it a couple of balls next cast. Really interesting that it's not gone that time. Right at the end of the peg, that one. Far left hand side. Tells me they're probably just drifting out the peg a little bit and it's time to start topping up. Bet it's another perch as well. Nope, skimmer. Not very good at your fish guessing today, Matthew. Beautiful fish. Beautiful fish. Look at them. Cool, aren't they? Now you might notice I've clipped up today, and a real nice little tip or habit to get into if you can is when you cast, try and cushion your slider and your rig in nicely. So when you actually hit your clip, you notice I'll cast it, but then I'll have my rod at a slight angle so that when it hits the clip I can move it forward, and what you'll see there is all the rig straightens out. So as I hit my clip and I cushion it and slow it down by moving the rod forward, all the dropper shot, the swivel and the hook bait flick past the olivette and everything lands in a lovely straight line. Whereas if you just cast, leave the rod pointing at the float and hit your clip, everything can bounce back and you'll struggle with tangles. So little habitual thing to get into. If you can hit your clip with your rod at a slight angle and just cushion that float in, you'll get far less trouble with things like tangles and wrap overs. Just going to make up a couple of balls ready now for the first feed. I'm going to go for 2 rock hard ones to try and pin them back down on the bottom, and then 2 a little bit softer, just so I've got a bit of attraction to bring a few back in. And I've just flicked in them a few bits of worms that I chopped up as well, so we've got a few fresh worms in there. A good little bit of advice for you is to try and make your balls all the same size when you're firing them in, and that way you'll get used to firing that size ball. And if you've got the same size ball and pull your catapult back the same distance every time, it'll go in roughly the same area. Now, one thing I'd always encourage you to do is always fire your bait a little bit short when you're slider fishing. The worst thing you can do, especially on a big open venue like this, is fire it past where you're fishing. You can always come back in on it if a few balls land a little bit closer, but what you can't do, especially when conditions get bad, is follow it back out. So whenever you're firing your bait in, always err on the closer side whenever you can. Still an odd bite, but again, right at the bottom of the swim they are now. So I think this chuck, and again, little perch, telltale signs, fish like that, you need to put some more bait in. So I think this cast, I'm going to give these 4 balls a nice fire out. Just like the initial feed, I'm going to try and aim 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 turns back. I'm going to try and aim slightly to the left of where I'm casting with these, just so that I can run my rig onto them. And you'll notice here I've got a nice setup with a backrest, so when you're actually firing your bait, you can just put your rod down, leave it separate, and it gives you plenty of movement and leeway to actually fire your balls in nice and cleanly. If you try and do it with your rod across your knee, you get a bite at the same time, it can be a little bit frustrating if you panic and you'll end up firing balls all over the place. I'm going to fire 3 or 4 in, try and get them all in a similar area, and just sort of reset that bed, because the fish came straight to it when we first fed. That last one went a little bit far for my liking. One little bit of advice Will Raisin gave me, really take note, if you do fire some balls short or far, just take note of how much further they go, because it's always worth then having a cast on top of it. So say at the minute I'm clipped up and I'm coming back 6 turns to where I'm fishing. If I fired 3 or 4 balls and a couple of them went a bit short, I might want to think about maybe winding back 7 or 8 turns instead, just so you're fishing right on top of it. But if you can be as accurate as possible, it will really help you out with this kind of fishing. More accurate you can be, definitely more fish you'll catch on this. See if there's any fish come to that little bombardment, then a few fresh worms. Nice little hit of 4 balls. 3 of them went exactly where I wanted, and 1 of them went a little bit far, to be honest, but hopefully we'll get a good response from them. Actual rod wise for slider fishing, you don't need anything special, but I'd advise a 13-foot rod as a minimum. And for me personally, you want something that's got a soft top action, so when you're striking into small fish like skimmers and roach, you're not going to bump them, but a little bit of backbone in the bottom, because obviously you're punching a slider out, 10 gram weight, 12 gram weight, big float, and often in tricky conditions. So something balanced, 13 foot, 14 foot in length, absolutely perfect. I love a 13-foot Aventus for it. Took them all over the world with me. They're absolutely fantastic. And they've got that lovely balance of softness and crispness in the top, but plenty of backbone in the middle and bottom end for tricky conditions and casting that slider nice and accurate. And also, you've got to obviously pick that line up when the float goes under. So that fast action in the middle, as you can see there perfectly, just picks that line up and you can connect with fish all the way out there, and it feels like another Underbank Skimbolina. Yes, great fishing in it. If you've not done any of this, come and give it a go, folks. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's really not as complicated as people think. 1 rod, couple of floats, bucket of ground bait. You'll have a fantastic day. Getting a little bit bigger as well. Nice when you can see them red worms hanging out the mouth, innit? Can reuse them. Got to recycle them. Take some picking out the horse muck, they do, I'll tell you. Wallop. The actual mix I've gone for today is a cereal based one. There's no fish meal in it, and on these places I prefer a plain cereal ground bait, just because I'm fishing for so many different kinds of fish: roach, perch, skimmers, bream, hybrids, and I feel like it's a lot less selective. So it's 50% supernatural dark and 50% supernatural light, the natural coloured brown one. And I've just put a little bit, about 2 pints of black soil in with that, just to give it some weight for obviously firing it out a long way in these windy conditions, and also to get it down to the bottom nice and quickly. And the beauty of that mix is, like I explained with the initial feed, you can put it in so many different ways to have a different effect. If you squeeze it a bit softer, it'll explode on the surface and leave a big trail of particles as it falls. But if you want to pin fish down, you can have the same ground bait, but just wet it up a little bit, squeeze it a little bit harder, and it'll pin them down to the bottom as well. So a versatile mix for this kind of fishing, so you can vary up the consistencies. Very, very important. Just missed that one then, because I was too busy talking about ground bait. And one other little thing that I've got to tell you about, as much as I don't want to, is, you'll probably know by now, I love a sweet ground bait, and any big natural venue, even commercial silverfish fishing now, I always mix it using the super sweet. It's just a very sweet liquid that's highly soluble in water. So what that means is, as soon as your ground bait enters the water, the sweetness comes out of it. And I'm convinced on big places like this, or vast venues, if you've got a big area of sweetness around where you fired your bait in, fish just come straight into it to have a look what it is. So bottle of that will do you for a couple of sessions, and all I do is I add it to the water that I mix the ground bait with, and then whisk it all in together so it's nice and evenly dispersed throughout the mix. You saw how much of an instant response I got today. A number of times I get off to a good start when I'm feeding that. It's definitely no coincidence. And they're right on it, look at that. Great fun, innit? Go on, they're super sweet. Even perch like it. It's a fat little one. It's got a belly like me after I've been to the pub, that has. I think one thing that a lot of people don't experiment with enough with this sort of fishing is varying up the consistency of your ground bait to try and get a response. Often when people are firing balls of ground bait in, they just squeeze them as hard as they can, put them in the catapult and fire them in. But you can do so much with this mix. It's very, very versatile. A nice one nipped squeeze there will make a ball that I can fire out effectively, but as that hits the water, it'll explode and leave a big trail of particles falling down. And by the same token, I can get the exact same ground bait, but if I give it a 3 or 4 heavy squeezes and just nip it between two hands, I've got the same mix, but I've got a ball that's absolutely rock hard, that'll go to the bottom and pin the fish down. And there's one straight away. They're so on that ground bait at the minute, right on top of it. But that versatility is really important. If you're not catching, a few softer balls to bring them in. And if you are catching or you feel like they're coming off the bottom, a few really heavy balls just to pin them down. It's a roach this time, look at them. Love the roach in here. Again, look at colours on them. Proper golden with red fins and a little orange eye. Favourite fish, a roach, definitely. Now, I really want to end on a skimmer, so I'm hoping this is a skimmer and not a perch, folks, but it's going to be the last fish because John's just teased me by saying there's a lovely little pub up the road, isn't there? I can pass it on my way in. Oh, it's a skimmer. It's a skimmer, so I'll let him off. And it just wrapped around there, look at him. He's in the mouth. And I think that's a cracker to end on. 2 bits of red worm dangling out in his mouth on that 16 pole special. An absolutely awesome day's sport on my favourite method at a stunning venue. I mean, look at it. Who wouldn't enjoy a bit of this? If this ain't getting you a bit of inspiration to go and give the slider a go, I don't know what will. Slide on.